So as Sherry mentioned, I've been doing research on mulches actually over 20 years now. And I'm learning new things about mulches every day. And a lot of things I'm going to tell you tonight will probably surprise you. And I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. It's probably easier to wait till afterwards, especially since they're recording. So anyway, let's get going. So this is not good. And I will tell you that I take all my own pictures, and my neighbors have learned to hate me. Because I find I'm lazy. I don't go any farther than I have to. And this is just down the street from where I lived. Supposedly these mulches are put down to keep weeds out. And as you can see, it does not do that. There's all kinds of grasses and horsetail and everything else coming up. And it's just plain ugly. So Sherry mentioned we're doing the good, the bad, and the really, really ugly. And this will help you make decisions when you're doing landscape mulches. And maybe even for your annual beds and your vegetable gardens. So what we're going to do first of all is just talk about general mulch qualities. Not a lot of detail. It's on your handout in terms of all the things that mulches should provide. So I'm not going to belabor that point. I want to spend lots of time with pictures so you can see what happens. We're going to really focus on organic mulches because for the most part you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of using organic mulches compared to anything else in our climate. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about wood chip mulches, arborist wood chip mulches, because that's what I do research on. And frankly, it really is the best possible thing, again, for our climate in our landscape plants. And then I'm going to give you a little tour through a case study that we did on weed control using wood chip mulches. So mulches can be broken down into a variety of categories. Anything that's a ground cover. It could be a cover crop if you're an agriculturist. It could be lawn. It could be any kind of spreading, creeping thing. Those are all living mulches. And so mulches all protect the soil. And so you're covering the soil, keeping it from being compacted or eroding. And living mulches are one way to do that. You can also use synthetic mulches. These include things like plastic, landscape fabrics, rubber. Those all fall into the synthetic category. Inorganic mulches, and these are really good if you've got an area that you're trying to keep drier and you don't want it to be really rich with woody debris. So if you have a rock garden or something, that would be rock mulches. And when you go east of the mountains and it's drier, this is a more natural mulch to use for those types of plants. So beach rock, brick, concrete, decomposed granite, lava, even tumbled glass, all those things would be inorganic mulches. And finally, we've got the organic things. So these will all break down over time. And they include things like bark and cardboard, compost, leaves, newspapers. It's all alphabetical. And finally, down to wood chips. So those are some of the things that you might see at their nursery center or be able to get cheaply and easily for free. So living mulches can really be fun. You can do a lot with them artistically, and again, depending on what your climate is and what you're trying to grow and the type of soil you have, you can use things that are water conserving, like a lot of the sedums, or you can use things that are edible, or you can use things that are just pretty. And you can have a lot of fun with those and not have to worry about reapplying mulches. Synthetic mulches are not great. We've spent a lot of time researching these. They are advertised as being a quick fix to weeds. They're anything but. In fact, they'll just make your weed problems worse, even though they say that it's a permanent fix. What will happen when you use these fabrics, and plastic is even worse, but fabrics are bad as well because they interfere with water and gas transfer between the atmosphere and the soil. And then if you use rubber mulches, and you've seen these before, so this is ground up tires, and initially you might think, what a great way to get rid of a problem, all these discarded tires, you grind them up and make a landscape mulch. The thing is that the stuff that tires are made out of is not great for your soil, and it's not great for your plants. And if you've ever been around rubber mulches in the summertime, they stink, and they burn your feet. And I talked to one woman in Texas who actually called me because I had the stuff online, and she was in tears. She spent like $2,000 or $3,000. She couldn't even go outside because it smelled so bad. And so I really discourage people from using rubber mulches. They just have absolutely no good effect on your soils or your plants. And this is what happens if you use weed cloth. Okay? I call it weed cloth because it's cloth that grows weeds. But supposedly it's to keep the weeds out. But as you can see, once it's down there, it serves as a nice surface for weed seeds to land. And that's where the soil blows in. And then that's where the rain comes. And so it's a great place, a great surface to grow. And the roots of the plants you're trying to grow are underneath all that. So they're not getting the benefits. And as a matter of fact, they're kind of being slowly starved for both oxygen and water as well as nutrients. And so that really is the opposite of what we want to do with mulches. And this is what happens, is that if you use these types of sheet mulches that are bad for tree and shrub and any desirable plant growth, they will start putting their roots on top of the fabric or the plastic. And then when you eventually get so sick and tired of it, you want to take it out, now you're going to damage your root systems. And I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who have gotten really irritated with the fabric or plastic, and they try to remove it, and it's just completely colonized with roots, many of them weed roots. And so those ones you don't really care so much about, but your trees and shrubs, yeah, it has a bad impact on those. So rather than even going down that road, just avoid using these products completely. They do have their use. And if you're someone who is putting in a vegetable garden, or maybe if you've got a small farm and you're trying to temporarily keep weeds out, you've got a fresh bed of soil, you can lay it down, it keeps the weeds from growing, but then you have to take it up, and you can't leave it down there. Rubber mulch, as I mentioned, is not great. It'll tell you that it prevents insects and weed growth, which is really pretty funny. And then, of course, it's recycled, and so that is what's appealing to people. They see the word recycled, and they want to do the best things, have a small carbon footprint, but this is not the right way to do it. There's lots of other ways to use up these tires. And they're not permanent, and fungi will grow in them. So rubber is a natural compound, and microbes live to colonize new sources of food. So there are things that are rubber-eating fungi. And just like there's oil-eating bacteria, there just are these things. And microbes evolve fairly quickly, populations evolve, and so they can evolve to use new food sources. Also burns, as you might expect. In fact, there was some interesting research that was done, about 30 years ago, looking at these different mulches and the flammability. And it was a classic study, and it was kind of funny when you read it, because, of course, you have to treat everything the same. So they had brick, and they had cobbles, and they had sawdust, and they had wood chips, and they had rubber. And of course, you have to try to ignite all of them. So they have this flame. They're trying to light bricks on fire, which is pretty funny. But you have to do it, because that's what you do. You have to treat everything the same. And the thing is with the rubber is that it is so hot when it burns, it's really difficult to put out. And you probably remember that. Those of you that are close to my age, you remember the tire fires. And it's the same thing. It's that material. It's very hot once it starts burning. In fact, it's been a problem when they use this for underneath the playground equipment, because vandals have learned that when you set that stuff on fire, it'll actually melt the equipment. So they're starting not to use it anymore. So it really is something to avoid in terms of putting on top of your soil. And it's a pollution source. In fact, the EPA classifies discarded tires as being a pollutant. So my husband, who always has very pithy and interesting comments about all kinds of things, says, how can rubber tires be classified as a pollutant, but then it's okay to put it on your soil as a mulch? And it's a really good point. So think about that if that's a pollutant to the soil, and it's illegal because it's a pollution source, then why is it okay to put it on your soil? Inorganic mulches can be fun too. So again, stones, and there's, if you have an artistic talent, which I have none, you can use different types of inorganic things to just make lovely pathways and areas where you want to have hardscape and you don't want to have to worry about weeding. And sure, you'll have a few little weeds to come in, but the drier the area is, the easier this particular method works. So if you're down on the, down in Southern California where this was taken, or in the east side of the mountains where we don't get a lot of rainfall, it's very effective, and it's actually what would be natural for those ecosystems. And we can do it here, but the problem is we get more rainfall. So you'll notice when you have stone mulch that there's always weeds that pop up where there's water running off from the sidewalk, because you're getting water there, and the weed seeds come in, and then they pop up. It's really hard to dig these guys out when you're trying to dig through stone. And it's even worse when the stone gets bigger. And so here we've got bindweed coming up through big chunks of concrete cobble. How are you going to get this stuff out? And then, of course, everyone's favorite, horsetail. So, I mean, stone mulches are great, and I think that if you're careful about how you use them, and you're using them where it's going to be a hardscape, and you don't have any plants that are that you're worried about, you can use flames or something like that, or boiling water to keep the weeds out of those surfaces. But when you have something like that, I mean, you just can't get to the roots of them at all. So we're going to focus on organic mulches because those are really the best things for your plants, they're the best things for your soils, and it's what nature does anyway. So a lot of the things that I always talk about are things that are supported with ecological research, and if we know it works in nature, you know, it's going to work for your garden as well. So if you look at an organic mulch, a woody organic mulch, you'll find on those roots this white fuzzy stuff. You've probably seen that before. And a lot of people used to worry this was mold, you know, and so they'd put down a fungicide or something. And actually, those are not just decomposers, but they're also mycorrhizal. So they're colonizing the roots, and they're actually a beneficial partner of almost every woody plant. But you have to be careful when using the organic mulches because there are some things that are going to be almost as bad as using some of the non-organic ones. And as you can see here, horsetail again popping through, and this is popping through compost. So you really don't want to be using fine textured mulches like compost or sawdust. And the reason is because to keep weeds down, you have to use pretty deep layers of mulch. You have to use at least 4 inches perpetually to keep light out. If you put down 4 or 5 inches of something that's really finely textured, you have the same problem that you have with the landscape fabric, you know, where water doesn't perk through, oxygen doesn't perk through, and so then you have low oxygen conditions in the soil. So if you use a thin layer, then the weeds come up. So this is the balance. You have to be thick enough to keep the weeds out, but not so thick that it interferes with water and gas movement. And that's the trick. So you've got to find the right balance. And that's kind of what I've spent a lot of my time doing research on. Now, one of the things that everyone used to use, I remember my mother always buying huge bags of beauty bark when I was growing up and hating this stuff because I'd get all those prickles in my hands. And now I have a scientific reason to hate it. And the reason is because it's waxy. So if you think about a tree and the function of the bark on the trunk, it's to keep water in and pests and disease out. So if it's waxy and you put it on the soil, it's not going to absorb water. And you've probably noticed this. You've probably seen if you use beauty bark that it tends to slough away if it's on a hill. It won't hydrate. And if it doesn't hydrate, it's not going to be able to share that moisture with the soil. It just is kind of this barren desert. And if you pick up this bark and look underneath, it's usually pretty dry. So even though it seems like a good thing to use, bark by itself is just way too hydrophobic to make an effective mulch. Things like nutshells and dried needles, which also are great things to use, you know, as part of a mulch, they also don't absorb water. So it's not to say you can't use these things. And again, these are really effective in pathways and places where you don't have plants growing, excuse me, because they don't absorb water. It stays pretty much dry underneath. You're not going to have weeds growing. So if you like using bark, you can use it for a pathway. The nutshells and other types of really hydrophobic organic compounds are really good for that type of use. For nurturing soil, they're not, because they just break down way too slowly because they are so hydrophobic. Now, one of the very favorite things of a lot of gardeners to use are different types of sheet mulches. And I'm going to not think about the synthetic ones anymore, but things like cardboard and newspaper. Okay? So the same things that happen with plastics and with landscape fabrics also happen with cardboard and newspaper, even though it's organic, and eventually it breaks down. But it's a sheet. Okay? It's not nice and chunky like other types of mulches are. And when you think about things trying to move through a sheet, it doesn't move very effectively. So one of the things you can kind of imagine is taking a piece of wet newspaper and putting it over your face and trying to breathe. And then having lots of sheets of newspaper over your face and trying to breathe. And that's the same thing that's happening to the soil, because there's things in the soil that need oxygen. Oxygen does not move through wet newspaper very easily. And the more layers you have, the harder it is for water to move through, for oxygen to move through. If gases don't move, water generally doesn't move very well either. So even though it seems like it's a good idea, it really isn't good for the soil. And if it's not good for the soil, then it's not going to be good for your plants. And I always hear gardeners talking about smothering the weeds. Smother is not what you want to do. Smothering is keeping oxygen out. What you want to do is keep the light out, because that's what the weeds need, that nothing else living in the soil does, right? It's just the weed seeds. If you use these sheet mulches, things like newspaper and cardboard, once they've dried out, they stay dried out for a while. So unless you keep them really wet, they become hydrophobic, and they don't reabsorb water very easily. They will eventually, but they do get hydrophobic. And then if you're concerned about things like termites or burrowing pests, they love sheet mulches. In fact, when they do research on termites and they're trying to figure out where termites activity is, the traps they use to capture them are cardboard, because termites love to eat cardboard. It's like candy. So if you're using cardboard, you're going to be attracting termites. They don't like wood because there's too many chemicals in there that they can't digest. But cardboard, it's fast food for them, and they love it. Rodents will burrow under sheet mulches. They can't burrow through chips because the tunnels collapse. Try sometime. If you see a big pile of chips, try to dig a tunnel out. You can't. Everything collapses inward. But you can easily burrow underneath fabric or newspaper or cardboard. Any of those things are very easy to make tunnels under. So what seems like a good idea actually has a lot of drawbacks. So here you can see, again, a neighbor who doesn't like me anymore. Cardboard, when it's wet, it just gets soggy. And the wetter it is, the harder it is for gases to move through that matrix. And then when it gets dry, it's really, really dry. So this just keeps, again, water from getting through. And then we're covering up the cardboard, in this case, with wood chips. So I see this a lot where people will use wood chips, but they always want to put cardboard under there first. I've never quite figured out why, but it just seems to be what they really want to do. And this is what will happen. The cardboard is so hydrophobic that the wood chips just slide right off. Now, if you remember that first picture I showed you, with the roots and the mycorrhizae, how nice and moist and everything was kind of integrated, that can't happen with these wood chips because they're separated from the soil by this cardboard. So they just move. If you have chips right on the soil, they get hydrated and you have things growing through them, the roots, the mycorrhizae, and they stay in place. In this case, it can't stay in place. It just slides right off. And all the weeds at the bottom are getting all the water because it's running down the cardboard too. And the roots of the desirable plants, these are snowberries, they're impossible to kill anyway, but they're not getting any of that water. So lasagna mulching is one of the things that I really try to discourage people from doing. And I know you guys probably love it. And I'm not going to tell you can't. You can eat lasagna. Everyone loves lasagna. And that's why everyone loves lasagna mulch, because it appeals to you emotionally. It does. All these things that you love to do that aren't based in science are always emotionally appealing, right? And so this is what you do. You try to mimic this, and there's all kinds of do-it-yourself recipes for doing this. And we love to cook, we love to eat, and so we try to put that into the garden as well. So what happens with this? It's a no-till method of soil prep, which is great. The more we know about the soil, the more we know we shouldn't be just tilling it up and making this fine coffee ground type material. I mean, it just destroys texture, it destroys mycorrhizae, destroys earthworms. It's just a really bad practice. And so we can use no-till methods, and that's that's the good thing about the reason for doing lasagna mulching. So you put down the cardboard or the noodles, then you put the compost in between to make the sauce, and it says, build it as high as you want. And so think about this, with all these different layers, especially of the cardboard, it's just one more barrier to water movement and to gas exchange. The more layers you have, the harder it is for things to move through it. So again, emotional appeal, there's absolutely no science behind this. Not one experiment has ever been done and published to show that this is any better than anything else. But it's just one of those things that people really want to do. So the cardboard, I want you to think about this. Pizza boxes don't leak, right? I mean, if they can go through the edges, but they do this for a reason, because cardboard also has wax in it. When corrugated cardboard is made, they impregnate it with wax. Amazon would not ship things in boxes that were going to melt in the rain. Okay, it takes a while for this stuff to hydrate. It takes even longer for it to break down. So think about pizza boxes and Amazon, and think about, is that the type of thing that you want to do in terms of isolating your soil from the elements? And a lot of people, they look at things like, like what's underneath the cardboard, and they'll see all these worms and stuff. And this can be the sign of an overly rich soil. The more layers of compost you put in there, the more nutrients you're putting in. And we've been doing some work looking at nutrient levels, especially phosphate, of home gardens, and they're off scale. They're off scale in every city. They're so high. And it's because we keep on adding all this stuff because we kind of use an agricultural mindset when we're doing fertilizer, NPK, right? That's the complete fertilizer. Those are the things that you run out of fastest with a crop. You hardly ever run out of anything but nitrogen in a home garden. And the more you add, the higher the levels get, and then you get all kinds of problems with nutrient uptake interference because of toxicity. So because there wasn't any science on landscape fabric compared to anything else, and gas exchange or cardboard or any of these things that people use, we actually did an experiment looking at the ability of gases to move through these types of materials. So we constructed these mesocosms, and a mesocosm is like a microcosm except a little bit bigger, and in this case it's buckets. And so each of these buckets is filled with soil at the same level, and this one is just bare soil, so that's our control. Nothing's done to it. And then some of them were covered with wood chips, 4 inches of wood chips, and some were covered with black plastic, and some were covered with other materials. So they're all the same setup except for what the mulch material was. And then we have these little tubes going in there, and those are actually our sampling ports. And I'll show you how this works in a minute. But this is how the whole thing was set up. And then they just kind of sat out and did their thing until we did our measurements. So what we did was we tested bare soil, our control. We did plastic mulch. We did arborist wood chips, 4 inches, which is, as I said, what you need to keep weeds out. Landscape fabric, 1 layer. Landscape fabric plus arborist wood chips. Cardboard, 1 layer. And cardboard plus arborist wood chips. So these are not all the things you can do, but realize when you're doing experiments, you have to replicate these. And so this, if you replicate, you have to have a minimum of 5. We had 7. And you can see this gets into be a pretty big experiment after a while. So we were just using things that are fairly common for homeowners to use as mulches. So this is what, it's not a very fun experiment in terms of having a plant, and there's no plants in this at all. But we analyzed carbon dioxide both below the mulch and above it. And we analyzed oxygen both below the mulch and above it. And this is what we did, how we set them up. So there's a little mesocosm. There's a lid on it now, so there's no gas exchange with the atmosphere. It's completely closed off except for those little ports. And through the ports, we took samples out. And then the samples got injected in, and then we got numbers. So this is what we did over and over and over again for a number of weeks to see what would happen with carbon dioxide levels and with oxygen levels. And inside of those mesocosms in the soil are microbes. So all these things were inoculated with compost, so we have lots of microbes in there. But of course, it's pretty simple. There's no earthworms, there's no plants. So this is kind of a very simple way of looking at oxygen demand and carbon dioxide production. So this is the graph we got from doing this. So this is only with single treatments. It isn't with the combination. But bare soil, that's our control, and you can see that it had the highest rate of carbon dioxide movement. Okay, so this is how quickly, the diffusion coefficient is how quickly it'll move through whatever material is there. And this coefficient will never change. So that's the good part about it. So you always know what the material is going to do. Other things might change in terms of temperature and water, everything else, but the coefficient is a unit of the mulch material, and it never changes. So wood chips is next best in terms of the rate, followed by cardboard, landscape fabric, and polyethylene mulch. Now when you look at this, it may not look like that big a deal, but each one of those bars is a factor of 10. So this is an exponential graph. So it's exponential like pH is or like earthquakes are. All right? So when you're looking at bare soil compared to wood chips reduces the gas transfer by about a factor of 10. But that bare soil is not what you would have in your landscape. This is an uncompacted bare soil. You'd never find this in nature, right? So a compacted soil would be worse, but we had to leave it, everything had to be the same. Cardboard is about 10 times worse than wood chips. Fabric is about 100 times worse than cardboard, and polyethylene mulch is about 10 times worse than that. So when you look at the differences, let's see here. So here's one, there's 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 times worse by using plastic mulch than by using nothing. So this is the type of thing you can use when you're making decisions. Do I want to interfere with gas transfer? Maybe you do. Maybe you've got reasons to do that, or maybe you have to use something, in a pathway, but it will tell you what that will do to gas movement. So obviously this is not measuring water, but as I said, there's no research on this. This is the first thing that's ever been done. And it will have the same effect in terms of reducing water movement and oxygen movement that it does on carbon dioxide. So this is really valuable, and we're actually going to have a fact sheet that comes out on this too for gardeners to use so they can see these data. So my favorite mulch material are arborist wood chips. And we started using these 20 years ago for some restoration projects where we were trying to keep invasive weeds out and get native species reestablished. And so arborist chips were something at that point that were free. They're not free around Puget Sound anymore. Are they still free down here? Yeah. You guys are lucky. Just wait. It'll go up. But if you can get wood chips, by all means, get them. Even if it's more than you can use, your neighbors can use them too. And it's like gold. I mean, it really is like gold in terms of what it will do for your soil. So there's a couple things people worry about. And so these are the questions, the concerns I'd like to dispel first. One is that a woody material, which as you know from composting, has a really high carbon to nitrogen ratio, right? And the higher that number is, the harder it is for things to grow because nitrogen gets bound up. So they're worried about that happening. And the second problem they're worried about is disease transfer. So if you have diseased wood chips and you put it down the landscape, what happens to the plants? Do the plants get diseased too? So those are the two big concerns, and the short answer is neither one is true. But I'm going to show you why. So now you should love wood chips, right? So here's some data that shows you what happens to soil nitrogen when you're using wood chips as a mulch. And this is from some other research we were doing. And you can see here that the carbon nitrogen ratio before the trials was 10.9, and that's an average. Okay, and 10 is like ideal. When it gets up to 30, then it's deficient. But as you can see by looking down here, for the control was actually a little bit higher. I mean, this varies. It varies from year to year. There's so much sorry about that. There's so much noise here that there really is no significant difference among any of those things. Okay? So it makes no difference if you're using the material as a mulch. If you work it into the soil, then you have a problem. But the soil pH and the soil carbon nitrogen ratio is not changed at all by using wood chips as a mulch. So that's the other thing. If you're worried about it acidifying the soil, it doesn't. So this is what happened. I mean, you can see this in nature. This is from a restoration site, and there's a Gary oak coming up right through those wood chips. And in a more ornamental landscape, you see bulbs popping up. There's no deficiency symptoms at all. They're not yellow, which they would be if there was nitrogen deficiency, right? If you work it in the soil, that's what it'll look like. So never, ever, ever till these things into the soil, because they will cause a problem. If they've been composted for a long time, they won't. But if they're fresh, they will just strip the nitrogen right out. So let's look at the fungal communities now. Okay, so now you're convinced that the nitrogen deficiency won't be a problem. The fungal communities in chips are almost always decomposers. They're not pathogens. Pathogens require, as you probably know from your disease diagnosis classes, that you have to have some certain conditions met. So one of those conditions are environmental conditions. And pathogens don't do well in highly oxygenated, well-drained conditions. They do really well in compacted, poorly drained anaerobic soils. That's when you have pathogens. When you have a wood chip mulch, even on a heavy, wet soil like clay, it really loosens up the soil, and you have much better oxygenation than if you didn't have it. So in a healthy soil, in other words, one that's oxygenated, well-drained, beneficial and harmless fungi that are in those chips outcompete any pathogens that are there, because those are conditions they do well in. The pathogens don't. So remember, the spores are always there. The spores of everything are everywhere. But they only become active when the environment allows them to do so. So they've done a lot of work actually with different things like Armillaria and Phytophthora and Thyronectaria and a lot of other pathogens where they've deliberately taken diseased wood, chipped it up, and put it down, and nothing gets disease from it. Because it turns out that pathogens need a fairly large piece of decaying wood to stay alive, and once they're a small chip, the pathogen's not active anymore. And then again, because you've got all these beneficials in there, because you've got a healthy soil, they can't compete. And the roots are actually colonized, as we know now, by a number of beneficial bacteria and fungi, just kind of like your skin is, right, in your gut. We all know about probiotics and keeping your gut healthy. It's the same thing with roots. They're colonized by beneficial microbes, and it keeps the pathogens from being able to get a foothold. So this is some of the work that we did. Well, this is the first experiment we did. So this started in 1999 when I was at the Center for Urban Horticulture in Washington. And we were doing some restoration work on the Union Bay natural area, which was not a natural area at all. It was an old garbage dump. Well, first of all, it was a peat bog. And then the city of Seattle used it as a garbage dump because that's what we did with wetlands, because it was just a swamp. So filled with garbage, and then when they finished doing that, they put a clay cap on it. And then so it's just a mess. It's just rampant with blackberries and every weed you can imagine, and lots of bunny rabbits, and that was what was basically there. So it's a great outdoor lab, and what we spent a lot of time doing is figuring out how to reestablish desirable plants and keep the invasive stuff like the blackberry out. So in this experiment, which we started in 1999, we had 6 plots, and they were all mowed down to the ground. 3 of the plots were sprayed with Roundup because that was the way to do things in 1999 when you're going to reestablish things, is to get rid of the weeds by spraying with Roundup. And the other half were mulched with about 8 or 10 inches of wood chips. And then the following winter, and so this would have been January, February of 2000, we planted 3 native plant species into these plots, same number of each one. It was mostly snowberry. We had a little bit of ribes and a little bit of holodiscus, but it was primarily snowberry. So that's what we ended up really reporting on because we had so many of them. So this is what the study site looked like. We are scientists. We are not designers. Everything's in straight rows. It's very boring. But it makes it really easy to count. And that was the point. We needed to keep track of all these plants and be able to count them. So as you can see, we have lots of snowberry, and they're all coming up in their rows. And this is the year following installation. So this is 1 year after. This field is one that was sprayed. Okay, so it was cut and sprayed. And as you can see, that red spot there is actually my technician who's out there measuring plants in a mulched plot. And you can see things popping up there. And you really can't see much here at all. There's a lot of grass there and some bare soil. And then if you look closely, there's these little rings of stones. And the reason we did that was because we had to be able to keep track of the plants because they were shrinking. Yeah. So imagine, if you will, trying to publish a paper in a scientific journal when you're describing your plants as shrinking rather than growing. But the reason they do, and you probably know this, if you have plants that are under water stress and they die back on the tips every year, they get shorter and shorter and shorter. So these things started out being 6 to 8 inch snowberries. And that one is like 2 inches. And they just shrank year after year after year until they were just gone because there wasn't enough water for them to survive competition with all of those weeds. So weeds were coming back. They're sucking up all the water out of this clay soil, and the snowberries just couldn't handle it. There is, here's one of the mulched sites in the summer. So you can see that the grasses in the foreground are starting to go dry as our conditions usually do in the summer when you don't have irrigation. This is not irrigated. But you can see the green plants back there. Those are the snowberries. They're growing right along. And that's the sprayed site, and all there are the grasses. You can't see any snowberries, and that's why we had the little stone circles so we can keep track of the plants. So that's summer. So this is like a year and 6 months after installation. Here it is 2 years and about 6 months after installation. And in our mulch sites, the snowberries were all setting fruit. So after 2 years, they're all producing fruit, which are producing seeds, which then allowed us to have more plants because all those seeds landed there and they started growing. So in addition to having shrinking plants in the sprayed sites, we had higher than 100% survival in the mulched one, which again is an interesting thing from a statistical standpoint, but it's because we had all these volunteer plants come in from all these fruits that were being produced. And that is one of the remaining snowberries in the sprayed site. So you can kind of see there's some little tiny leaves there, you know, and that's Angie's hand, and her hand is not huge. And those leaves were, I mean, it was impossible to find these things without the rocks. And as I went back, I've gone back every year to take a look, and I think there might be, I don't think there's any snowberries left, but for a while there was a couple that kind of just struggled along. So when we wrote this up, you know, we were able to report that the ones in the mulched sites were larger, they grew more vigorously, and they reproduced quickly and much greater quantities than the plants that were in the herbicide-treated plots, and they survived better. And the thing was, is we only had 3 plots, and statistically that's usually not a very good thing to do because there's so much variability in the field. But when everything dies in one treatment and everything else is 100% survival, it doesn't make any difference that you only have three replicates. So this was the beginning of my interest in wood chips. So we published this in 2005, and that was the first of these types of experiments. I went back to look. This is 2008, so this is 9 years after we'd started this, and that's one of the plots where the snowberries are still there, little island of snowberries. And there's one of the ones that there's no snowberries, but the blackberries come back. So it's just gone right back to the way it was. So this is why the city of Seattle is able to no longer use Roundup, because it wasn't doing any good long term. They now routinely use wood chips when they're doing restoration, and a lot of places do. It's readily available, it's natural, and it suppresses weeds. So this is the second kind of longer term experiment that we did, but this is with trees and looking on not only weed control, but measuring the effect on trees and looking more now, not necessarily wood chips, but how deep should they be, how big should the particles be, and can you use recycled wood rather than just stuff from arborists, because these are things that people want to know. So we looked at arborist chips, and we looked at recycled chips from a company called Recovery One, and this would be from building material that hadn't been treated with any type of pesticide and no types of bad materials. It's just all finished wood that was ground up. So it's not quite as nutritious as the arborist chips. And we looked at coarse chips and we looked at fine chips. So we had 2 different types of chips, and we had 2 different textures of chips. And this is what the plot looked like. I love this picture. So this is up in Mount Vernon, and you can see all these little squares. In the center of each of the squares, there's a circle. In the middle of that circle is a tree. So we had Douglas fir, and then we had snowberries. But I was really focusing on the Douglas fir because snowberries grew everywhere. They laughed at this, except for the control. They did not grow in the control. And the control is something like this, where there's no mulch at all. Because again, like the other study, if there's no relief from the competition from weeds, things just can't get established. So you can see that the difference in texture, you can see difference in color, and that just shows, and also the difference in height. So we had some at 10 centimeters, some at 20 centimeters, and some at 30 centimeters. And 30 centimeters is more or less 12 inches. So it's more or less 4, 8, and 12 inches in these treatments. This is 3 months later what it looked like. The weeds go crazy. And if it's a thin layer of mulch, they go really crazy. So as you can see, in between all of the plots, they're growing well. In some of these ones where the mulch is very thin, the weeds are encroaching onto it. But where the mulch is nice and thick, it's a little island of mulch, and the tree is in the middle, and so it's protected from all of that competition. There it is a year after, and I'm sorry for how dark that is, but I think you can still see that all the darkness is weeds, and you still have these islands sticking up there, a year later, and that's helping the trees get established without competing for resources. So what we found from this was that using these coarse, deep mulches, so the coarse texture rather than the fine, and the deeper the better, was the best for both suppressing weeds and for tree establishment. So what we found during this is if we're using a fine textured mulch, that the trees did worse the deeper it got, because again, they're fine, it's harder for oxygen to move through and for water to move through, and the weeds actually grew better in the fine textured mulch than they did the coarse. And the reason probably is because with that really fine textured mulch, the weed seeds fall on top and they can stay there and get established. In the coarse stuff, they kind of fall through the cracks and then they can't get established. So by the end of the second year, the very deepest, the 12-inch mulch treatments had no weeds at all. And so that was really pretty incredible. And this manuscript is going to get published this year as well. And this was also important, as I showed you before, is that wood chips will not change the soil pH, and they will not change the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So they will protect the soil, they'll nourish the soil, they will not change the chemistry of the soil. So all of this we kind of put now into practice for real. This is kind of the case study now. So this is not a controlled experiment. This is using what we found in the controlled experiments to see what you can do yourself. So this is a 3-acre wetland that used to look like this. And so a bunch of Scots broom in the foreground, and you can see the trees in the background. That's where the wetland is. And so there's a creek running through there. So Douglas fir and oak and all these wonderful trees. And then as you're moving away from the creek where it's dry, then you get into all the weeds. So all the Scots broom and the blackberry. So I don't know if you can tell or not, but this is all blackberry. This is this oak tree. There's blackberry crawling into the oak tree, 50 feet up into the oak tree. I mean, miserable stuff. And this is something that you can't just go and prune. We had to take a tractor to this because, I mean, the canes were like this big around. The things had been there forever. Really, really nasty. But we did. We went in and we just mowed everything to the ground and then came in with the wood chips and chipped everything, again, about 12 inches. Once everything was chipped, then we went in and I had an army of students that was working with me to learn how to do this and planted native species in here. Now, you don't plant into the wood chips. You move the chips aside, you plant, then you replace the wood chips. So this is all with native plants. And then during this time, I had to keep track of the data because we had to work with the county on this. Wetlands are controlled by the county. And if you're doing any kind of wetland enhancement or restoration, the county pays really close attention. So every year I had to write a report, take pictures, and it actually worked out well because then I was able to document what happened, for talks like this. So I took pictures at the same spot every year, 4 different directions, and that was part of the report. So we'll come back to this picture in a minute. In 3 years, we had our alder, our ash, our poplar, and our willow growing up here. And the tree in the very back is where the wetland is, so that's not what we were planting. But in the foreground, all those things are only 2 or 3 years old. And they were growing like crazy because the soil is getting moisture from the wetland. But the wood chips are helping hold it in there, so the trees are just going completely nuts. And as they're doing this, they're creating a canopy, and neither Scots broom nor blackberry does very well in the shade. So what we're doing is we're creating a shaded environment to keep those weeds out. And the cool thing was for us is it was a very complicated design. This is what you do when you're doing restoration. First of all, you put in the primary trees, which we did. And then you're supposed to come back in the next year and put in understory species. And we didn't, because nature did it. So one thing you'll learn about me is I am cheap and I am lazy. And if I don't have to spend the money or do something that nature's going to do for me, I don't do it at all. So there was there was cones that came down from the Douglas fir. As you can see here, we've got one coming up and another one over there. We had that big oak. All those acorns coming down, the squirrels buried them for us, so I didn't have to pay them at all, which is great. And snowberry, those came in. So all of these understory species came in on their own. I was able to report on them. I did not have to buy them. I did not have to plant them. So that was kind of a nice surprise. And the volunteer rose, native rose, and elderberry. So all these things that belonged there, the seed bank was there. They just needed to have the right conditions and not have competition with the blackberry and the Scots broom. And then here you can see, the alder trees are starting to make a closed canopy. So we still have weeds, if you want to consider them weeds, buttercups. But buttercups they're natives. They're not noxious weeds. Something's going to grow there, and we much rather have those than the blackberry. So you can see that shade-loving ground covers came in rather than the sun-demanding things like the blackberry. Where it was too dry to support a lot of tree growth, as we got farther away from the wetland, the trees didn't do as well, but the grasses came in very densely, and they kept out the blackberry too. So they're keeping light out, and the seeds couldn't, blackberry seeds couldn't get started. So here's that picture again. The first year, same area, same direction, 4 years later. Oh, wow. And we did nothing. We didn't irrigate. We didn't weed, because for restoration projects, you can't. You have to just let nature do its thing and see what happens. And when you have that kind of success, why not do it this way? It costs virtually nothing to do except for paying for labor. That was my big expense, was having, paying people to plant things. So if you're thinking about this, we had $10,000 to do this. We only used 8. I said most of it went to paying the students. In 5 years, we had 80% canopy coverage, which is considered to be a success by the county. 98% tree survival, because we were able to count all the new things that came in on their own. And it was supposed to take 10 years, and the county came in and had an outside analyzer, look it over and give her feedback, and she said she'd never seen anything like it, and she said it was good after 5 years. Didn't even have to take 10 years to do it. It was that fast. So, I mean, when you do this, and you're doing the research and publishing and collecting data, you can't help but be impressed by how good wood chips are for really restoring a damaged soil and allowing desirable plants to get established. So anyway, your handout has a lot more detailed information on some of these points. And I want to also make you aware of some of the resources that are out there that you can find. As Sherry mentioned, I have a bunch of books back there that are on gardening myths and plant physiology and all that kind of good stuff that you're welcome to look at. The native plant collection. And I will say about this particular book, which just came out last month, is that this is not an encyclopedia of native plants. What it is selected plants that will do well in a garden situation. Because there's a lot of things that won't. And there's a lot of things that do well, like madrone trees, do really well in very unkept conditions. They don't like a lot of water, they don't like nutrients, and they don't like compacted soils. They're not a great tree to grow in most situations because we just don't have the right soil for it. So all these plants are things that really should do well in a garden. If you're into DVDs, I have a series out from Great Courses on the science of gardening, and I did find out from them that if Master Gardener programs want to use this, and they get the series, that they can use it for everybody. You don't have to have one for every person. You just can't charge money for it. So they're very anxious to have people use this for educational purposes. On the web, I've got my my myth files, and all of these addresses are on the last page of your handout, so you don't have to write this down. But this is what I started doing back in 1998, I think, was writing about gardening myths. And so you'll find lots of things here that will probably astound you because they're all things I used to do. When I was getting my Ph.D. in horticulture and we didn't know any better, now we know better. It also has links to a couple other pages that I'll show you, and one of those is our WSU gardening page. Now, this isn't just for Washington State. I mean, you guys are right next door. The information is just as good for you as it is for Washington. And it has all kinds of categories, including soils, compost, and mulch. So there's fact sheets on rubber mulch. There's fact sheets on wood chip mulches. There's fact sheets on all kinds of mulches. They're all peer-reviewed. They're all within 5 years of being published, and they're all free downloads. So it's a really good resource. It is our WSU Master Gardeners website to use. This is what they're supposed to use for the newest information. This is the blog that Sherry mentioned. We've been doing it for 10 years now. And the nice thing is you can search it. We try to put out a new blog post every week with our various bloggers. And it's on all kinds of topics. So if you happen to go through and search for something, just about anything you can think of, hugelculture, they have posts on that. We have posts on biodynamics. We have posts on lots of different things. And then because, I'm an extension educator, and if you're an extension educator, you have to do social media. So we started with the blog, and then we moved into Facebook, because you kind of have to be on Facebook if you're going to do education. So we started with a page, and the page is kind of a resource. So new studies come out, things that are all science-based, and we link to them, and then people can share them. And a lot of Master Gardener programs all over the country and in Canada use this as a source of vetted information. And then we have our blog group. Okay, so the bad thing about, the drawback to blogs and to the page is it's really top down. It's us telling you things, and then you can read it, but it's really hard to get a dialogue going. And the group, anybody can post a question. And so it's truly a conversation. So there are almost 23,000 people in this group. And we have rules, and the first rule is this is a science-based group. We don't do anecdotes, we don't do home remedies. And we really hew to those guidelines, and we'll delete comments that are anecdotal or that are home remedies immediately. So when you go on there looking for good information, you're not going to find stuff that's all over the place. It's going to be the science, what we know of the science right now. So it's a really great place to find information. There's some very knowledgeable people that are faculty all over the world that are in this group. And there's people that are experts with vegetables. Jay Scheidt, who you probably know as your OSU plant pathologist, he's part of this group. You know, there's a lot of people that are sharing their knowledge, and it's a wonderful place to get that kind of feedback. And again, you can search it. So we have thousands of posts, and we started this in 2011, so this is 8 years worth of posts in there. And it can be quite something trying to go through them all, but it's a good place to start.